Welcome everyone, and a very special welcome to the heads of mission and senior diplomats with us here today. My name is Francesca Iacorto, and I'm an advisory board member at the Pearson Centre. I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. In that context, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 26th webinar on major policy issues related to COVID-19 and how they are affecting our society. Our ongoing project is called COVID and Beyond, recognizing that we have a lot of issues to address as we plan for the recovery and rebuilding that will be slow and long. Today, our subject will be yesterday's throne speech and speeches by the Prime Minister and other party leaders, as well as a session of Parliament in the months ahead. You may know that we provide a biannual briefing to heads of mission at the start of each session of Parliament. In the past, these have been held in person at the Canadian Museum of History, and many of you have joined us. While today's session will be virtual, it will be just as informative and exciting as the sessions of the past. So welcome to all of you from the Diplomatic Corps, and thank you for your interest in the political and government workings of our country. You will know that our centre is named after a former Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson, perhaps the most notable Canadian multilateralist ever. So it's a very special pleasure to host you today. We have two very well-respected heads of mission who are our honorary co-chairs today and three experienced strategists with three different political parties. We have with us today the High Commissioner for South Africa in Canada, Sibong Iseni Dlamini Minit Atbo, and I apologize if I mispronounced that name, who has been in Ottawa since 2017. She will speak first. Kevin Bosch is a former advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and three Liberal leaders before that. He is currently Vice President of Public Affairs with Hale & Knowlton Strategy. We also have with us today Denise CLA, who's a conservative strategist and was press secretary to the Honourable Andrew Scheer while he was leader. She sought a nomination for candidacy for Member of Parliament in 2019 and currently serves as a consultant in the area of public affairs. And we also have with us today Emily Taman, who was an NDP candidate in the 2015 and 2019 federal elections, and now serves as legal counsel with Champ and Associates. Our moderator today will be Andrew Cardozo, who of course is the president of the Pearson Centre. He's also an adjunct professor at Carleton University and a columnist with the Hill Times. The last word will go to our other honorary co-chair, Susan Lejeune Dalgierzek. Again, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And she has been a British High Commissioner to Canada since 2017. So a warm welcome back to the Pearson Centre podium to our two High Commissioners, as well as Kevin Bosch and Dennis CLA, and welcome to the first time to Emily Taman. I should mention that the Pearson Centre is preparing an ongoing briefing program for senior diplomats that goes beyond the session. Please feel free to call on Andrew after this session if you would like more information about it. With respect to today's format, the panel discussion will last about 40 minutes and then be followed by a Q&A period before we end promptly at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Please use the question box on your screen and we will get to as many questions as we can. With that, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Francesca, and I'll turn to High Commissioner Dlamini Minit-Atbo for her words of welcome before I start with the panel discussion. Please go ahead, High Commissioner.
Thank you. President of the Pearson Centre, Mr. Andrew Cardozo, my honorable co-chair, High Commissioner Suzanne Lejeune Dalgierzek, distinguished representatives of the political parties, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to yet another important session, this diplomatic briefing. At the outset, I wish to express our sincere gratitude to Andrew Cardozo for once again arranging this crucial briefing, which is indeed beneficial in our line of work. The throne speech is an important occasion which seeks to outline government's policy vision and proposed program for the for months ahead. It is a speech that seeks to bring Canadians together in working towards a common vision. The previous Thorn speech was delivered on the 5th of December 2019, and since then, Canada and the rest of the world has been overturned by the coronavirus. This virus has caused a public health crisis. It has created uncertainty in communities and has applied brakes to productive economic activity. Moreover, the impact is to be felt for months, if not years, even as we implement social and economic measures to mitigate the epidemiological risks. Like many other countries, Canada too has had to revisit, review, and adopt new strategies and programs for the country's response and recovery. The Throne speech brought into sharp focus the challenges facing Canada, some exacerbated by the pandemic. While it is indeed logical that the main priority in the immediate to short term for the Liberal government is dealing with the pandemic, the Throne speech also highlighted the longer term vision that includes more money for child care, long-term care, an action plan for women, affordable housing, jobs, a pledge to stimulate green recovery, and initiatives to address systematic racism. Indeed, this 150th Throne speech since Confederation was ambitious. It was expansive, it was expensive, and a number of promises were made. However, the speech did not receive support from all. There has been skepticism on its ambitiousness. It warmed my heart, though, that the speech touched on addressing systematic racism in Canada. This is an important aspect which Canada can no longer afford to ignore. Recent high-profile deaths at the hands of police in North America have sparked ongoing protests and debate about the issue of systematic racism, not only in the justice system, but in other facets of daily life, like employment, housing, healthcare, and education. The measures mentioned in the Throne speech to address the entrenched challenges facing minority groups in Canada and First Nations have been previously stated. However, there seems to be little or no progress in this regard. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls concluded that decades of systematic racism and human rights violations played a role in the deaths and disappearances of the women and girls. While the inquiry has been asserted by government, nothing has been done. Recently, Prime Minister Trudeau said that as much as this pandemic is an unexpected challenge, it's also an unprecedented opportunity. He said, this is our chance to build a more resilient Canada, a Canada that is healthier and safer, greener and more competitive, a Canada that is more welcoming and more fair. Ladies and gentlemen, after listening to the Throne speech, it would be interesting to hear from our panelists what their take is. Did it paint a picture of a more resilient Canada? Are Canadians convinced that the vision of their government is a Canada that is more welcoming and fair to all? And did the Throne speech succeed in outlining how a healthier and greener Canada will be achieved? I am really looking forward to hearing the views of these illustrious panelists on these important matters. I thank you.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, and thank you for the overview you provided, including the fact that this is the 150th Throne speech. You've added to our body of knowledge today. Thank you for doing that homework. So let me ask the panel. I'll start with you, Kevin Bosch. You have worked with the Prime Minister. You were an advisor to him at the time of the first Throne speech in 2015. For you, what are the highlights of the Throne speech yesterday?
Well, I think you know, and the High Commissioner gave a good summary of some of the highlights in the Throne speech. They've divided into 4 sections, or 4 foundations, as they call it. So the first one is dealing with the existing pandemic, the existing crisis. In that regard, they said they're going to do what it takes. Whatever Canada needs to get through this, they'll do whatever's necessary and find whatever money is necessary for that. The PMO was pretty quick to raise the fact that when it comes to short-term crisis funding, we can borrow that money at extremely low interest rates, and we know exactly what that's going to cost us over the long term. They're separating that kind of spending from what they consider regular spending, which will have to be spent over the long term, and of course we won't know what the interest rates are going to be 10, 15 years from now. So the next part was all about supporting individuals and businesses, extending benefits to those who need it, to those who are not captured by the existing EI system. There's a commitment to create a Canadian recovery benefit that will assist people who need it. Childcare was raised, and I get the sense the government is quite serious about childcare now. I know they've raised it a lot in the past, but I think there's a real recognition now that childcare is economic policy, and that they look at provinces like Quebec where they have a serious childcare plan, and it's done an incredible job of boosting Quebec's economy, helping women have more retention in the workforce. And so I'm expecting something major to come forward on that. Obviously working with the provinces who have a key role when it comes to childcare. The third section of the throne speech was about relaunching the economy, what they call Build Back Better. A lot of this is focused on making the economy greener and cleaner, green technologies. Certainly there's a recognition that the pandemic has hit women harder than any other sector of the economy. They actually used the term she-cession in the throne speech. And so the government's talking about doing an economic plan for women in the economy. And the fourth part is basically what we're all fighting for in the first place is who we are as Canadians. And this is the section that takes on systemic racism, Canada's improving official languages, Indigenous relationships. A lot of the initiatives that were put forward by the Black Caucus have been adopted, holus bolus into the throne speech. So now, of course, it'll be putting the meat on those bones, and actually the devil will be in the details, and the proof will be in the pudding. So we'll see where that goes. But overall, a very progressive, very, very ambitious throne speech.
Thank you, Kevin. And can you just tell us, yesterday evening there was the unprecedented speech to the nation by the Prime Minister and then the other leaders. What's your sense of what the purpose of that was, and was that achieved?
Sure. Well, I think one of the main reasons is probably that most Canadians aren't like us. They don't hang on parliamentary calendars and sit and watch throne speeches very regularly. So if you want to get to the people, you better go where the people are, which is on TV or streaming services. No one's confirmed this to me, but there's a possibility they didn't really want Julie Payette to be the voice of the government these days, because she's having some challenging issues. So I think having the Prime Minister articulate those issues directly. And the third reason, I think we're all concerned that there's going to be a bit of a second or third wave for the pandemic. As we as Canadians, as we move inside, go back to work, go back to school, flu season comes, it's getting worse in Canada. I think the Prime Minister wanted to directly and in as wide a form as possible deliver the message that we're not out of the woods yet, and Canadians need to take the actions necessary to protect the health and the health of those they love.
Yeah, it sort of reminded me of the speech he made in kind of mid-March when he said to Canadians around the world, "It's time to come home." He was doing those many briefings, but that particular message stood out, and it seems to me because he didn't add anything more to what the government journal had said, but he was just trying to say this is serious.
I think that's it. And I mean, he is the most well-known, effective spokesperson the government has, and so why wouldn't you use him in the biggest forum you could to drive that home? So I think that's why they did the address to the nation yesterday.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Denise Cieli, thank you for joining us. We often see you on television and in other roles. You've been press secretary to Andrew Scheer until recently. Tell us about your thoughts from a Conservative point of view about the throne speech.
Well, I mean, certainly, as we understand that the throne speech is a very high-level document that outlines a government's priorities and, of course, the desire to set a vision of what Canada would look like with a renewed mandate for them. And so, of course, that is why it is a confidence vote. And in fact, in terms of the pandemic, it has really changed what the government would be able to share typically. So we have the situation where it's a minority government, and as Kevin pointed out, 4 pillars. And I think in some ways the Liberal government has been very consistent in terms of sort of saying we want to fight the pandemic, we want to support Canadians, build back better, and the values piece. But in terms of from a conservative perspective, many conservatives would point to, well, look, the place for those kinds of conversations is not in the prorogation of Parliament, but it is actually in the sitting of Parliament. So I think there's still conversations happening around that. But look, is everyone on board in terms of the opposition parties about the need back in March to everyone gather around and provide the much needed relief and benefit to Canadians? That happened with support from all of the opposition parties. And as the summer progressed, there was a sense that, look, let's have an economic plan here. What does it look like for Canadians to eventually go back to work? Put something on the table. So it wasn't necessarily an economic update. What we got was a snapshot, which then revealed, I think, probably, many people wouldn't have been surprised that Canada was now sitting at $343 billion deficit, $1 trillion in debt. The debt to GDP ratio just went out the window. So I think in terms of what we would have seen from the Conservative response in terms of the speech from the throne, and let's be clear, I think they've said they're not going to support it, is this idea that it's not just build back better, but build back stronger. So where is the plan? And as Kevin said, the devil is in the details. So the throne speech is a high-level document, but it's legislation that's going to put meat onto this. And for what it's worth, I think I would share with this group is that there is a serious nod to the NDP. So I suspect, I don't have a crystal ball, but I suspect that when the confidence vote comes around, it will pass with the support of the NDP. But Emily, you might have something different to say.
Okay, well, thank you, Denise. And Emily, there's the perfect segue for you. You've been a candidate for the New Democratic Party, being very involved in the party. What are your thoughts on the throne speech?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I agree with most of what's been said. I'm still a little confused about exactly why the prorogation of Parliament was necessary, given what was in the speech from the throne in the end. I mean, I think I'd love to know what was going on behind closed doors between the setting of extremely high expectations, suggesting that this speech from the throne was necessary because it would represent a significant new direction and a new agenda for the government. I'm not sure that it really achieved that. And if anything, it was clear in the days leading up to the speech from the throne that there were efforts in the media to sort of lower expectations a little bit. I don't think this really does represent a huge change in direction for the Liberals. There's I mean, the number of sentences in the speech from the throne that started with the phrase, we will continue to, which is fine, but I think in terms of having made the decision to prorogue Parliament rather than present this speech from the throne, in more in due course, I do think there was political maneuvering there that was unfortunate. I mean, I understand circumstances have changed considerably, but I didn't see a significant change in the government's agenda, except to the extent that they were able to tie some of their pre-existing priorities into the issue of the pandemic, probably in an effort to get increased buy-in from the public. And I don't necessarily object to that in principle because, but I just don't think there was a ton in there that was new. I mean, there were, for example, Kevin made mention of a proposal for some kind of national early learning and childcare strategy. I mean, that's something certainly that New Democrats have called for a very long time, and which Liberals have in the past proposed as well. And I would agree that it was reassuring to see, though not really surprising, the government very explicitly refer to the gendered nature of the pandemic, the particular consequences on women and also on racialized people. I think that was really important. But again, I mean, on the question of fighting systemic racism, I didn't see a lot that was particularly substantive. Not that we would necessarily expect to see that in a speech from the throne, but speaking as someone who has spent most of my career working in the criminal justice system, for example, I mean, the notion that everything that the Black Caucus has called for was here, I mean, I just don't really see it. And mandatory minimum punishments would be an example of a criminal justice issue that's not controversial among experts, that the Liberals promised in 2015 and again in the most recent election and still haven't followed through on. So, I think this government is very strong when it comes to declarations of intent and can sometimes be quite performative when it comes to these things. So in terms of where the NDP stands, though, I mean, I would agree. I don't have particular scoops to share with you, but that I do expect that really the proof will be in the pudding, and the question will be, for example, at budget time, what kind of resources are being attached to some of these commitments, which I think will speak more directly to the good faith of the government in proposing them.
Right. So to date, we've seen that the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois have indicated that they're not going to support the speech from the throne, which sort of leads it to the NDP. Do you think they will be? Is it your sense, Emily, that they will support the throne speech?
I mean, again, I was able to see Jagmeet Singh's comments after the Prime Minister addressed the nation yesterday, and he did put out some policy proposals that he seemed to convey as being kind of necessary preconditions, and these were things that were not found in the speech from the throne. In particular, a sick leave policy, which again would be something that I think New Democrats have long called for, but in the particular context of a pandemic, I think are really, really important, because if we do want people to stay home when they're sick, that's a lot to ask of people if it means foregoing their paycheck. So, I mean, I expect it will likely receive support again, because I don't think there's a lot in there that's objectionable. It's just a question of whether it would be followed through on. And I think, that could be the subject of a future confidence vote in another context.
Yeah, and I will just tack on to what Emily has said here. Jagmeet was very clear. He said it's words on paper. So where's the beef, as it were? And I think there is enough in there that the NDP would support this liberal agenda. But at the same time, from the Conservatives, there is that question around, how are we going to pay for this? Notwithstanding the fact that we understand that there are immediate and necessary supports to Canadians. But here's what's happened. The government, through the pandemic, and in fact through the throne speech, did not mention some very, very key industries, including the oil and gas sector. So Albertans are looking at that and sort of saying, well, where is my voice in whatever the new government agenda is? So I think it's probably would not have been any surprise that Conservatives were asking many of these questions, as they had been for the past several months. But again, the devil is in the details. What does that legislation look like? How much money is on the table as Canada sits with $343 billion and of deficit and $1 trillion plus.
But there is a bit of a conundrum, though, for the Conservatives, because on the one hand, you point to the growing deficit, but on the other hand, I don't think you would be against most of the programs that are costing this much, because certainly the support to people and support to small businesses, I think the Conservatives have been very in favor of those measures.
Right, and absolutely, it was the Conservatives that called initially for the increase of the wage subsidy from 10 to 75%, and great that the government was able to put that forward. But I think what the Conservatives typically say is, we have to provide immediate relief to Canadians, but then there ought to be a concrete plan. How do we move forward from there? So I think, and this is the tricky stuff, because like, look, number one, like who wants to vote down the government in the midst of a pandemic? I guess maybe we should ask people from New Brunswick or the Premier of BC, who's called an election, or Saskatchewan. We're about to have an election, but I think these are really, really tough questions that are being asked. And of course, in the Canadian tradition, it always happens in the House of Commons. And when that's not sitting, it makes it that much harder.
Yeah. So Kevin, talk to us about those economic issues. Where do you see, which are the parts of the throne speech that deal with economic recovery and rebuilding?
Yeah, well, you see, the government talked about a 1 million job strategy. They talked about a cleaner, greener, more just economy coming out of this. I think these are things, these are things the Liberal government has wanted for a long time, and so now there's an opportunity with the needed recovery to make that focus. So they're not going to turn their back on their climate change plan, or this government that has been focused on having a more feminist approach to government policy. So I think you're going to see that there. On the economics question, I mean, the government has made it clear that they think they can borrow what they need to in the short term because they can get that at low interest rates. Over the longer term, that is going to be an issue. They are going to have to look at how does are there going to be cuts in other areas? Are they going to have to look more seriously at defense spending? Are they going to have to look more seriously at infrastructure for the long term? But I think in the short term, the last thing the government wants to do is sort of pull back any supports and whatnot. I'll agree with the other panelists here that I think we're not going to get an election this fall. I think there's enough in what the government wants to achieve and what the NDP put on the table. I think there's absolutely common ground there, and I would expect the government will come forward with an olive branch and find enough of the NDP can support the speech from the throne.
Yeah, I want to ask all three of you to comment on the SHE session and in particular the discussion. They didn't use the word national childcare, but a program, or seemingly a program that would end up being a national childcare program. Primarily, it seems interesting after many years of making the case for national childcare. We're now at the point where the economic necessity of that is most evident. Emily, can I start with you talking about the importance of national childcare, which for the first time sees a lot of support from the business community?
Yeah, I mean, I think the economic case has always been there. There has been a strong economic case that is well researched and documented and has been in front of many governments for many years. I guess, in the particular context of the pandemic, number one, if they're serious about implementing a program of the scale that they seem to imply, that's going to take some time. And I think one thing that would be really important for the government to be thinking about is the very particular childcare challenges that are the result of the pandemic, that are separate from the generalized challenge in finding safe, reliable, high quality childcare. And so I'm thinking, in particular of looking at things like respite care, because there are going to be a lot of circumstances where kids might be excluded from school for various reasons. So the kind of really conventional childcare, deficient as it is today, I think the pandemic puts very particular challenges around that. And so it would be nice to see some kind of thinking and analysis about how to deal with that aspect. Listen, if it takes a pandemic for the case to be, better heard by decision makers, and that precipitates it actually coming to fruition, that's fine with me. But I have to say, almost in general, when it comes to issues of social inequality, one of the things that I have found frustrating in watching some of the public discourse about this is the notion that the pandemic has somehow exposed inequality, or a lot of these issues, housing insecurity, lack of childcare, women's participation in the workforce, racial inequality. These are not issues that should not have been apparent to decision makers on the basis of evidence for a really long time. So if it means that there's more public pressure and therefore more political will, then that's fine. But in the throne speech, it was characterized as having been laid bare. But I have found it really frustrating when I hear people say that these inequalities have somehow been exposed or are apparent now somehow for the first time.
Yeah, would it be fair to say that decision makers have known that all along, but the public haven't really focused on those issues, and it's now more in the public awareness as opposed to just the decision makers?
I think that's right, but I also think it's to the discredit of decision makers who've had the power to actually, bring the needed changes that it took. Because if you have that evidence in front of you, you can go to the public and make the case. I don't think that decision makers should necessarily sit back and wait for there to be a public outcry, because especially when it comes to things like minority rights, it takes a lot more to get a widespread public engagement in issues like that. But there's no question on things like, for example, racial equality, there is a much more widespread movement, and I'm glad to see the government at least consider capturing some of that momentum and doing something about it.
Yeah, Denise, what are the Conservatives' thoughts about national childcare?
Well, so look, certainly all of these things are tied to how do we get people back to work? And the numbers are showing that women have been affected more significantly as a result of the pandemic. So what do those supports look like? And I think there's a series of mechanisms. Of course, affordable childcare is one that would be embraced by pretty much everyone in the political arena. I think what I would want to say, though, is what are the steps and the plans? Because these are conversations, right, that have been happening for years. So where is it that it actually outlines, what does that look like? How much does it cost? Because if a single mom is working 2 shifts, and does it make more sense to have her work an additional shift, or is it about her being able to get additional childcare? These are conversations that, quite frankly, I don't think Canadians have had. The last time I do remember, though, because of course it requires provincial support. The last time I remember was back in 2006, where apparently it would have seemed that Paul Martin had at least some modicum of agreement from 10 provinces, and then the NDP voted him down on a confidence vote, and so now it's back to the drawing board. And Quebec has a very solid, at least according to them, childcare system, and they would be just the side of them saying, write us the check and let us do what we need to do, even though we already have a program. So there's going to be tons of negotiation that has to happen. So words on paper.
Kevin, I think you were there in the Paul Martin government when
Yep.
Liberals last put forward national childcare. Do you think it's going to happen this time?
I really do. I mean, I think that the political will was there when Paul Martin was there. I think what's even added to that now is, well, certainly there's a greater awareness from everyone that childcare is vital for the economy to function, given the whole pandemic situation. I think any parent who has children under the age of 6 who's been juggling a job and childcare during the pandemic should get the Order of Canada. I honestly think we should just send them all out in the mail. I don't know how you could possibly do that. What also has changed is Quebec is the situation in Quebec, and I live in Quebec. I worked with the childcare system in Quebec. It does work, and I think provinces across Canada are looking at Quebec and realizing that model is effective. Quebec had one of the strongest economies coming into the recession, and I think, and that's not traditional for Quebec. And I think people recognize that is the childcare system. It's allowing women to have greater attachment to the workforce, allowing parents of both genders to have greater flexibility in raising their children. So I think there's a recognition that childcare policy is economic policy, and so I really think there's broader support. There's better cooperation between the federal and provincial governments than there's been in a long time. And I think that's because in a crisis, everyone steps up to help their citizens. There's no luxury of having these partisan disputes anymore. And I think the government wants to build on that excellent working relationship they've had throughout the pandemic and move forward some of these issues on childcare. It's a provincial issue. Yeah.
Although I think in the last 24 hours, the Quebec government and the opposition parties have been saying, no, just give us the money and stay out of our.
Well, for Quebec, that might be how it works, because Quebec does have a functioning childcare system, so that they may get additional funding without any requirement to do anything. But I think for the other provinces, I think the federal government wants to convene a table, get the provinces and the federal government together, put some money and some resources behind it, and say what can we do, and not just on childcare, on long-term care facilities. I think everyone would agree that was something that was a disaster in Canada during the pandemic. The worst part of the pandemic for Canada was what happened in long-term care facilities. So I think the federal government wants to, again, convene a table, bring the provinces together, create some national standards, and ensure that the next time we have a pandemic like this, we're not dealing with that kind of system anymore that puts our most elderly Canadians at such risk.
Yeah, and just on seniors care, long-term care rather, do you see that being a change to the Canada Health Act, or are they going to be?
Well, that's the clear power that federal government has, is the Canada Health Act. That would be our ability to get involved in the issue of long-term care, because so much of it is related to the provinces. So I see that as certainly a convening power that the federal government could bring everyone together and if possible, add that to the Canada Health Act. But I think that it's going to begin with a discussion, begin with bringing the provinces and the territories together with the federal government to talk about this.
Okay, Kevin, I want to start you off with on the matter of global affairs, international affairs. We have a number of diplomats on the line today. Yep. The last year has not been stellar for Canada, not having won the Security Council seat. Mm-hmm. At a webinar we had about a month ago with Bob Rae, the new Canadian ambassador to the UN, he said, look, when he's out there talking to people, nobody's asking him about what happened. People have just moved on from there. But clearly in Canada, we're kind of smarting about that. What's your sense of the international approach going forward?
Well, I don't expect it'll change very much from the Liberal government. I think appointing Bob Rae, I mean, we all know Bob Rae well. I think he's a fantastic choice for UN ambassador, and he'll make sure Canada hits above its weight at the UN. I can guarantee you that. I worked for Bob directly for a number of years.
Well, just since you mentioned that, just tell us in a sentence or two why he's good for that job, given your experience with him.
I mean, he's a dog with a bone. I mean, he just never takes no for an answer. I mean, he's a one-man diplomatic force in his own way. He won't be reactive. He will be out there pushing a very aggressive agenda for Canada. I mean, we saw what he did in the report in Myanmar, and right. I just know he's going to be driving a very activist agenda, because he wouldn't go about it any other way.
Okay.
Trade's going to be very important to Canada. We obviously have what's happening in the UK, the need for a new economic arrangement with the UK. The United States, of course, is always a critical issue for Canada. There have been definite challenges involving the Trump administration, depending on what happens in the election this fall. And even if it's a Democratic administration that comes in, there are often challenges with that as well. Democrats tend to be a bit more protectionist in their trade policy, although it's hard to imagine how they can be much more protectionist than what Donald Trump has done. China's going to be the world's largest economy in a few years. India will quickly catch up and surpass them in population growth. So there's going to be a shifting of the center of gravity internationally. Canada always believed that we have to have these rules-based system in place, or smaller countries like Canada will get eaten up in the system. And so we're gonna have to do a lot of work in that sort of multilateral rules-based system and make sure those international organizations are bolstered and strengthened.
Okay, thank you. Denise, what are the Conservative priorities for international affairs?
Well, look, I mean, certainly when Justin Trudeau first became Prime Minister, he declared that Canada was back and went on to negotiate a series of, or actually ratify a series of international trade agreements that the Conservatives had put in place. So, of course, you know, just very tough for Trudeau and the Liberals to lose the UN Security Council seat after making a lot of hay about what that would look like in terms of Canada's reputation. And of course, you know, the sleeping giant south of the 49th, which is, you know, can be sometimes unpredictable. Combination of, is it tariffs today or tariffs not? So I think one of the things that Conservatives had identified from the very moment that Canada was in a position to renegotiate the new NAFTA 2.0, was that there were so many concessions made, and Canada was just becoming increasingly weak on the international stage, and no more is that more evident than in the Canada-China relationships. We have our two Michaels who, at last count, have been imprisoned for some 650 days. So that is something that the Conservatives are concerned about. And then just certainly for this audience, right, in the throne speech, we heard very little about international affairs because it was an inward-looking throne speech, naturally so. It's about fighting the pandemic. But one of the pieces was Canada as a proud trading nation. And we think about the renegotiation of what Canada, Britain, Canada, UK trade deal looks like. How do we then go on to deal with Canada, China, and those relationships? What's our relationship outside of all of these pieces? So I think, unfortunately, the Liberals are very, very weak on foreign policy and foreign, the relationship has eroded. We think about the disastrous trip, some would argue, Conservatives would argue, that the Prime Minister made to India and the frayed relationships there. But all of this to say is the throne speech can be a reset, but we didn't hear any of that in terms of international engagement and relationships, aside from, I think, what we all understand, Canada is a proud trading nation.
Okay, Emily, I want to ask you next, but I just want to remind our audience that you can send in questions online in the question box on your screen. So please, which is on the top right-hand corner, so please feel free to do that. Emily, tell me your thoughts about the NDP priorities for international affairs.
Well, it's funny because just having segued from a conversation about childcare, I was saying to my husband last night, you know, I'm really surprised there was nothing at all in the speech from the throne about Canada's place in the world. And then I was reminded that one of my children had interrupted me while I was watching the speech from the throne, and I missed the last 5 minutes. And that is where I went back and read the text, and sure enough, there is a section on that. You know, I think, you know, in particular, you know, yes, on the one hand, this was a speech from the throne in the context of a pandemic, so we're going to be inward looking, but this is a global pandemic. And I mean, we can put every appropriate public health measure in place in Canada, but if we don't contribute to fighting the pandemic internationally, then, you know, our efforts are going to be for naught. So, you know, speaking for myself, I think I would just really love to see a firmer, more concrete followed through on commitment in relation to international development in particular. You know, Canada has become such a laggard internationally in that regard, and those needs are going to be only increasingly more acute as the effects of the pandemic are felt internationally. And that is an economic issue for Canada as well. So I do think that that's one area where there is passing reference in the speech from the throne. And again, that's what this document is. We wouldn't have expected a lot of details, but I do believe that every speech from the throne since the Liberals were first elected has made reference to increasing our contribution, you know, to international development, for example. And that just really has not been borne out. And I think the need between the effects of the pandemic and the ongoing effects of climate change, need in the global south in particular is only going to get greater and greater. And the more we allow those commitments that we've made to falter, I think then the need is only going to be greater. So I mean, I think that's one area. And again, I think it's just not good enough to simply constantly make declarations about Canada's leadership in relation to issues such as human rights. I mean, I think it's time to really rebuild some of the capacity at global affairs and really be quite concrete with the types of measures that we're taking if we're serious about contributing in a meaningful way to those kinds of issues.
Okay, Kevin, your colleagues on the panel have been somewhat critical of, if I can put it nicely, of the government's role on international affairs. Do you have a 30 seconds defense on that?
Sure. I mean, I would note the Conservatives were not successful in getting a seat on the Security Council either. I think, in my view, one of the biggest reasons Canada didn't get that Security Council seat is we were running against 2 European candidates at the time, and as you'll know, the slot that Canada has open for it, we're considered part of the European and North American group. So it's tough for us, I think, to get a seat in that when we're running against homegrown candidates.
Should there have been more discussion of international affairs in the throne speech?
Sure. I think I'll agree with a lot of what Emily said. I think the government has a lot of rhetoric when it comes to foreign affairs, but it'd be nice to put more resources behind it. I, for one, would like to see the Pearsonian ideal of a proper commitment to international aid actually realized. So I think the government has to realize that they have to walk the walk and build toward that to actually deliver it.
Thank you. You get an extra point for saying Pearsonian. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Denise, let me start with you. I want to ask all of you to give us a couple of names of MPs to watch in the new Parliament, either in your party or in another party, people who are new and probably not as much noticed or who have new roles.
I think for the Conservative front bench, naturally, of course, the new leader, Erin O'Toole, a long-time member of Parliament, but his front bench is very, very strong. We have Deputy Leader Candice Bergen from out west. His whip, interestingly enough, is from Quebec, which underscores the importance of the Quebec voice in the front benches. And then you've got upstarts, folks like Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry MP Eric Duncan, who was, I think, elected in a by-election, who's just been performing very, very well. And look, insofar as I think maybe the Liberal bench and in some cases the NDP bench has issues with how Pierre Poilievre, the shadow finance critic, performs. He's so strong and drives home a message and kind of gets in those headlines. So Erin O'Toole has a very, very strong front bench. It's diverse in terms of region and language as well. And he has Tim Uppal as well, pinch hitting in a very significant way for him. So excited to see what they will do when Parliament is recalled.
It's recalled now, isn't it?
Well, until December, it's hybrid sittings, right? But the pomp and circumstance that we understand to be Parliament. Yeah.
Emily, your thoughts about New Democrats or others who are MPs to be watched?
Yeah, I think, for people watching and listening, obviously the leader, Jagmeet Singh, I think you saw yesterday how he really is at his strongest when he's connecting with people on an emotional level. I think he has like a degree of empathy that really resonates, but he's probably known to some extent, at least to people listening and watching. I would highlight, in particular, 2 Indigenous women, Leah Gazan from Manitoba and Mumalat Kakak from Nunavut, who are really, really impressive women. really, I think, holding the government's feet to the fire in very real ways, and in relation to, equality issues in general, but Indigenous issues in particular. And Mumalat Kakak in particular is a very young woman. She's an Inuit woman, and if people are looking for someone to kind of check out to see a different and really important perspective, that's someone. Matthew Green in Hamilton Centre as well has been doing some really, really interesting, what he calls Parliament to the people. So he's taken very seriously sort of taking his experience as a parliamentarian and trying to help people just understand, demystify a lot of what happens on the Hill, for people who maybe aren't like us, who have alerts set for when the next speech from the throne is coming, for example. It's a small but mighty caucus, and certainly I've been really impressed with a lot of what I've been seeing coming out of the New Democratic Caucus.
Thank you. I will agree with you, especially with regards to Mumalat Kakak. I think her Twitter tweets are really very interesting in terms of really educating the rest of Canadians about life in the North and about Inuit. Kevin, your thoughts about leading MPs to watch?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I should say that when it comes to cabinet, it's Chrystia Freeland every day, all the time now. Now Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Certainly Justin Trudeau plans to run in at least one more election and hopefully win it. But after that, I doubt he'll run in another election as leader. I mean, the last guy who won 4 elections in a row is Wilfrid Laurier. So leadership will come to the fore in the Liberal Party, and right now Chrystia Freeland is head and shoulders ahead of anyone else in that race. For the new MPs, I would highlight Soraya Martinez from Hochelaga in Montreal. She's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration. Really impressive. Also Marcus Pawlowski, he's an emergency room doctor from Thunder Bay, Rainy River. Really getting a lot of attention, listened to a lot these days, given the whole health issue has come to the fore. I'll highlight a couple of folks who are elected the last term too. Nate Erskine Smith. Nate Erskine Smith is from Beaches in Toronto, our biggest maverick. You have no idea what Nate Erskine Smith's going to do, because we don't know what Nate Erskine Smith's going to do. Happy to take on the large grocery stores and whatnot in the last Parliament. So I think he's one to watch. Greg Fergus heads of the Black Caucus. A lot of the report that he put together was adopted in the throne speech. And I'll highlight Lenore Zan from Nova Scotia, a seasoned provincial politician, and has already made a name for herself in Ottawa. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. And would any of you like to highlight somebody in a different caucus that you find interesting?
I actually was going to point to Nathaniel Erskine Smith, not only because who's a Liberal MP that Kevin mentioned, not only because I agree with a lot of what he has to say, but also because I think he's a really important example of a backbench member of Parliament who understands his role and who takes his role seriously. Just as opposition MPs have a role in holding the government to account, so do backbench MPs from the governing party. And I really admire him for having the courage of his convictions. He's been extremely effective and outspoken on issues in relation to the opioid crisis, in relation to medical assistance in dying, and he's also a animal rights activist who's taken up some issues like that in some of his private members' bills.
Okay, thank you. Denise, your picks from the other parties.
I would certainly, just looking at the NDP, of course, the honorable member from Nunavut, young woman, and really just in terms of, this is a completely different voice that in some ways Parliament has never heard or seen before, but in a very particular way. So the highlight that she's bringing to what the reality of Inuit folks in the North, or in Nunavut specifically, is, it's the sort of thing that makes you sit up and listen. When she stands up in the House, there's an authenticity, a genuineness there that you're like, okay, well, we need to understand what's really happening out there. And sadly, I think a successive.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, your thought?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the conservatives that has always really impressed me is Garnet Genuis from Edmonton. A very thoughtful, very smart guy. I think he has a very bright future in Parliament. And I'd also like to mention Jenica Atwin from the Green Party from Fredericton. A really impressive individual. If she were running for leader of the Green Party right now, I'd be a bit more worried, because I think she could could actually achieve something. I think they're getting a little bit low profile leadership race, but I think she's someone to watch for sure.
Okay, we seem to be getting, I think I'm hearing a bit of breaking up here. I don't know if can you hear me okay?
Can hear you, yep.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions here from the audience, and I'll start, Emily. So I'll ask you just to be very brief in this. I'll ask Emily to start. How would you evaluate the green recovery level of ambition in the speech? Do you expect more on green investments and climate change, or did some elements rather surprise you positively?
I think it was nice to see the million jobs plan tied directly into green infrastructure. I think that's probably the right direction to go. I think for strategic reasons, the government probably pulled back a little bit from articulating some of its ambition. I think until they are able to properly grapple with the oil and gas industry on the one hand and the climate change issue on the other in a way that they can talk credibly, I do think there's still some lacking there. And again, I just don't think there was enough there to really weigh in on its level of ambition one way or the other.
Okay, Denise, a question for you. What will Canada's position be between now and the date of the US election with regards to the US election?
The conservative position, I suppose, look, the voters in the US get to decide.
And should the other parties do the same?
Yeah, well, presumably, right? The thing is, insofar as we understand that these are functioning democracies, and I don't think anyone is suggesting, right, that the U.S. is not a functioning democracy, that, come November 4th, that aside from hanging chads, though, right, that might be a thing. So, but certainly it's optimistic, right? Whatever happens, and President of the United States will be inaugurated in time. And of course, I think regardless of who the Canadian Prime Minister is, we absolutely have to always work with whoever occupies the office of the White House as Canadians. It's critical.
Okay, thank you. And Kevin, a question for you with regards to an Africa policy. Should Canada have an Africa policy, and what would it address?
I think the government's well aware that we're going to see long term over the next 100 years. There's going to be a decrease in the population in most areas around the world. China is going to be almost half of what it is now. The one place where it's not going to slow down is Africa, and I think they recognize that Africa is going to be the future when it comes to economic growth, certainly over the next 50, 75 years. So Canada needs to position itself and have a clear engagement in Africa. I think the government's tried to be more involved in Africa than, say, the previous Harper government, and I think that's going to expand and vitally important.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask you each to just close it with about a minute of thoughts you have about what you see happening in the next while. First is, do you all think there will not be an election between now and, say, the end of the year? And what do you see as the priorities in the next few months? I'll start with, who'd like to start? Go for it. Emily, go for it.
Okay. I don't think there'll be an election by the end of the year, and I also really hope there won't be an election, and I hope that all the parties will work closely together to try to avoid an election. This government's not even quite a year old. I think we're in a pandemic. Regardless of what's been happening in some provinces, it's different in the provincial context than it is in a federal election, and I think it's incumbent upon all the parties in this particular context to kind of put some of the gamesmanship aside, not to sound like a Pollyanna, but I just think it's really important, and there's a lot at stake. And I don't want to see more polarization, because that good working relationship that we've been having, I think, among the provinces and the feds as well, I think it's important that be maintained and not sort of fall apart in the context of partisan issues that come up in an election. In terms of priorities, I mean, again, inequality, income inequality, racial inequality, climate change, these are issues that I think it's just so critical that we not lose focus on them because of the urgency of this pandemic. And I would put climate change really at the forefront of that. It's just, there's so much at stake, and every year that we lose is just totally critical. And so I think that really aligning some of those economic issues with our obligation to fight climate change in a real way, I think will be really critical going forward.
Great, thank you, Emily Tamman. Denise Sealy.
Yes, so certainly in terms of from a conservative perspective, there is no desire at all to see the government fail, but what Conservatives have been asking for and have asked for is a credible plan, at least even some sort of a plan to say, to talk about where we are in terms of the pandemic. So more testing, support for the provinces to increase their testing capacity. What does that look like? And then, of course, a plan to build the economy back stronger, which is key. So what is happening to small businesses who, by no fault of their own, were forced to shut down, and the support for families. In fact, when it is all said and done, there is no doubt that it is this point, when we get past the pandemic, what does Canada look like in the next 5, 10, 15, and of course, as Canadians face a $343 billion deficit, you better bet that Conservatives are asking, what does that look like in the next 15, 20 years? So I think that's the point that Conservatives are trying to articulate. Let's support Canadians during the pandemic, but there has to be a plan.
Okay, thank you, Denise Sealy. Kevin Bosch, your last thoughts?
Yes, so I'll make you unanimous. I don't think there's going to be an election this fall. Next spring, all bets are off. I think, you know, once we hit the 16-month mark on a minority government, who knows if it's safe to have an election? Then, you know, the parties may want to have one. I do think the focus this fall is all going to be about protecting Canadians. I do expect, unfortunately, you know, as Canadians move back inside, things will be worse. I think, you know, climate change, this government recognizes that climate change, the crisis from climate change could be as bad an impact or worse than some of the things we've been seeing with COVID. So that they're serious about addressing it. Economic update in November, I expect that to be pretty robust, maybe a bit of a mini budget where the government starts rolling out some money. They want to start getting some of these programs moving now, recognizing the government could be defeated next spring. So you need to have this stuff in place now if you actually want to make a difference.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Kevin. So I want to thank 3 of you panelists, Kevin Bosch, Denise Sealy, and Emily Tamman, for joining us today and providing us with your feedback. You're seasoned party people who've done various things in your party. So thank you for bringing that voice of experience to us today. I want to tell the audience that our next webinar will be on September the 30th. It'll be on John Turner, Canada's 17th Prime Minister, who passed away last week, and it'll be on his legacy, past, present, and future. So that's September 30th. With that, keep in touch with our website for a number of other webinars planned in the weeks ahead. I want to thank High Commissioner Delamini Minatambo for opening us up today for her opening comments, and turn for closing comments to High Commissioner Susan Lejeune-Dalgazec. Please go ahead with your last thoughts, closing thoughts. I think you're muted.
I'm not. I'm unmuted myself.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the panelists. Yet again, the Pearson Centre has proved what an invaluable resource you are to diplomats posted here in Canada. You know, coming from a country with its own Westminster system, some of the opaqueness of the system is less opaque to me than it is for some of my colleagues, and I think you have provided us yet again with a window into some of the complexities of the system and a really clear analysis of the big challenges facing this government and Canada more widely. One of the things that struck me in the comments that the panelists made was how similar this conversation would be in almost every country in the world at the moment. And one of the things I think that this horrible pandemic has done has forced us all to identify how we really are in it together, and how so many of the issues that Canada is confronting are identical to the ones which South Africa, the UK, Korea, whichever country it is, we all facing exactly the same things. The challenge is enormous. The things I picked up from your various comments, first of all, yes, this is an incredibly high level presentation of what the government wants to do. I think there's a difference of opinion about how ambitious it actually is. Is it a case of promising a huge amount and delivering a lot, or is it a case of actually not promising very much at all and delivering a bit of that? Or will they deliver everything they promise? So the devil will now be in the detail and the legislation, and also in the money. So let's see where the money is allocated to deliver on some of this stuff. I think whoever said that these problems or the issues, the really serious issues with social care, with systemic racism, with the impact on women more than on men, have always been there, but this pandemic has shone a light on those issues. Again, not unique to Canada. My own country is facing exactly the same issues as we try to rebuild. I'm delighted that you've all recognised the importance of the focus on building back better. For the British government as chairs, the next chairs of the COP26 climate conference, making sure that the pandemic is not an excuse to push climate issues to one side, and that remains at the front of our response, is a very, very important aspect of our own planning. And I was delighted that at least one of you mentioned the UK-Canada Free Trade Agreement as part of the things that the whatever government is in power in Canada in the future needs to focus on, an issue very close to my heart, as you can imagine. You have all been very frank and forthright and very honest and very insightful. And I know that all the colleagues who are on this call are really grateful to you for sharing your knowledge. I found it fascinating. My own report will be much better as a result of what you've told us this afternoon. So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to close this session, and thank you to the Pearson Centre again. Thanks.
Well, thank you, High Commissioner. Since the audience is not, we can't hear the audience clapping, I'm going to ask all of us to clap for each other as we go out. So thanks very much, everybody.